Good morning and Happy New Year to all of you as we end 2023 and enter into 2024. And we don't know what next year holds for us, but we know that we are in God's hand. And no matter what, good or bad, happens, God is with us. I really enjoy the passage that we're studying from, or I'm reading from today in John chapter 13. And this passage, or this section, which runs from chapter 13 through 17, takes place on the night before Jesus is killed. He is traveling. They have the Lord's Supper, as we've just celebrated this morning. They are traveling to the garden, and Jesus is talking to his disciples, knowing that by that time tomorrow he would be dead and in the tomb. And so what he says to them, I think, is critical. I kind of see this section in John, kind of the bookmark closing Jesus' ministry that opened with the Sermon on the Mount. And so Jesus is saying things to his disciples that he really wants them to remember. Because we human beings have very faulty memories. We don't have to have Alzheimer's or dementia to forget things, do we? I mean, we're forgetting things all the time. We forget bad things, or we remember bad things and forget the good. There's all kinds of ways that we forget. And yet, the things that happen to us, the things that are in our memories, are what makes us who we are as individuals. And so whether that be good or bad, or it's usually a combination of both, those are the things that make us who we are. And yet, we tend to forget. And in particular, in this passage, John is reminding them about a number of things, but he is particularly reminding them about love. Now, most of us, if you've lived through the month of December, you've watched some kind of Christmas romance movie, I'm sure, because they're everywhere. It's hard to escape them, really. And most romance movies, are, if you watch them, they have very sweet messages, but at the end is almost always the same. We're in love, and this love is going to last forever, right? And all the popular songs about love talk about, I will love you to the end of time. I'm loving, all these kinds of things. And yet, people forget about love, don't they? We see it happen all the time. We see it in marriages. We see it in churches. And John, as he writes his gospel, and especially, again, writes the small letter of 1 John, uses the word love over and over again. And the question is, why? Well, John is writing probably anywhere from 40 to 50 years or more after the death of Christ. The early church has come, now it's become established in all over the Roman Empire. And the early disciples really had this message embedded in their memories and thoughts. This idea of loving one another, of being this people like Jesus who loved people and accepted and forgave people. They remembered those words. And yet, by the time John writes his gospel and writes the letter of 1 John, he is writing those things to remind them of this very important and critical message that Jesus said and gave to his disciples. And so when we come to the words there in John chapter 13, where he says, "A new command I give you, love one another. As I have loved you, so you must love one another. By this all men will know that you are my disciples if you love one another." The thing about this, Jesus saying these things is he doesn't just say it once. Over in chapter 15, he says again, this is in chapter 15, verse 12. My command is this: love each other as I have loved you. Now, why does he keep saying it? Why does he, it's enough that he says it once, right? But when you find words like this repeated again and again, it's because Jesus and John wants the church to remember the importance of love. Now, when we talk about love that lasts forever, we realize that oftentimes love gets forgotten, especially when we get in an argument. Okay? You see this in marriages. When couples argue and fight, sometimes they say unkind things to each other. Why? Well, because they've forgotten. They committed to love each other, right? That somehow that we get in these arguments, and because we argue and fight and this kind of thing, we forget that commitment to love. You see it in relationships that, people get involved in careers and in caring for children and doing all kinds of things. And you see marriages where they've done that and they get 20, 25, 30 years into the marriage, and the children leave home and they look at each other and say, why did I marry this person? I've even seen people who kind of rewrite history, where they say, well, I never loved this person, even though they've been married for many years. And yet when you go back and look at their letters that they wrote when they were young and in love, and look at all the things that they said to each other and promises they made to each other, it's just not the case. There was a time when they loved each other, but they have forgotten. They've forgotten the love. They've forgotten the commitment, the promises they made to each other. Or in churches. How many churches do we find fighting and saying ugly things to each other? And I've seen it in probably most churches have had this experience, where people get so committed to winning an argument or making their point or getting their way that love goes out the window. And people forget. I've said this to couples when I've talked to them, counseled them, in premarital counseling. You can be right or you can be married. You got to make a choice. Because marriage is not about, in those things, is not about being right. It's about being committed to loving the other person, even when you don't agree. And so, when being right becomes more important than loving, love is forgotten. Now, the early church, we look at the disciples in the Gospels, and what do we find? We find a bunch of squabbling children, almost. They're arguing about who's the best, who's the greatest. They argue about all kinds of things. They even disagree with Jesus about a number of things. But, interestingly enough, by the time we read in Acts, especially Acts chapter 2 and the coming of the Holy Spirit on those disciples, there really is a spirit of love that just seems to permeate that early church. They loved people. They loved each other. They loved the widows and the orphans. But 50 years later, that message is being forgotten. And so John writes his gospel in his letter. Now, we look at the early church and we find, especially after the first century, we find the church is beginning to write what we call the creeds. The Apostles' Creed is maybe one of the earliest ones. If you read the Apostles' Creed, you would say, well, yeah, those are all things I believe in. Those are all things I agree to. And the creeds were often written to establish the truth about certain obscure doctrines. How is Jesus both man and God? All kinds of things like that. And the creeds became points where people argued, and if you won, then you got to exclude the people who lost. And the interesting thing about the creeds is this: none of them use the word love anywhere in it. And yet Jesus, what did Jesus say in that verse that we read just a few moments ago? By this all people will know you are my disciples, if you love one another. And so we find this failure to love is something that just permeates the life of churches, in life in many ways, that we forget how important it is. It's one of the few direct commands that Jesus gives his disciples. He even calls it the new commandment. The command to love your neighbors yourself has been there in the Old Testament, but now it's love one another as I, Jesus, have loved you. A much higher standard of love than what they've had in the past. But again, when we put doctrinal belief before love, or when we exclude people because of moral behavior or because of all kinds of things, when love is excluded, or when we run into these problems, it is a failure to love that we're dealing with. And that's a heart problem. That's a heart problem. And yet Jesus invites us into something that is incredible. He says he invites us to love each other as he, Jesus, loves them, as he loves each of us here this morning. No matter where you fall, no matter what beliefs, and you may disagree with somebody about their beliefs and this kind of thing, Jesus commands us to love one another. Because we are all followers of Christ, and we're all trying to follow him. And so we're to love each other. And Jesus loved in particular ways, and I'm going to point out several right now. First of all, because he loved people, he invited them to come and be with him. And it didn't matter. Jesus invited lots and lots of people to follow him, didn't he? You go through the Gospels and you find Jesus saying, come, follow me. And sometimes people would for a while, and then they'd turn back. Sometimes they came like the apostles did, and they stuck it out. Sometimes people said, no, I can't do that. It's too demanding. And yet Jesus invites them. And so, who did he invite? Who did he invite? Well, one of his disciples was termed and identified as a zealot. Okay? Now, zealots to the Romans were terrorists. They were assassins. In fact, one of the symbols of a zealot was that the assassin's dagger that they carried, that they used to assassinate Roman officials and soldiers and this kind of thing. They were assassins. They killed people. They led this guerrilla warfare against the Romans. And the Romans turned around and brutally killed lots of Jews and crucified many of them. But this one decided to follow Jesus. Simon the Zealot. And there he was with these very strong beliefs, and the beliefs that Jesus is there, the Messiah was going to lead them to freedom. And yet Jesus invites him, in spite of the fact that Jesus is not going to lead a revolution. And he invites him to come and follow him, as Simon does. Another one was a Roman tax collector. You talk about the opposite end of the spectrum. Here's the servant of big government. Here's the servant of, collecting taxes for the Romans, for the enemy. And Jesus invites him to come. And the interesting thing is, here are these guys together. How do you think Simon and Matthew got along? I imagine there were some tense moments between the two of them. I imagine there's a lot of things that we could say about the two of them, but Jesus still invited them, and they accepted, and they followed. And it was true of all the disciples. They were all misguided. They all had wrong ideas about who Jesus was and what he was going to do. But Jesus invited them, and they came, and they followed. The second thing I would point out about loving is not just inviting people to be with you, because this is what we're to do within the church, right? That we invite people to be with us, and we with them. But secondly, Jesus respected them as human beings, as people who can make choices. Jesus does not manipulate them. He doesn't try to control them. He gives people the opportunity, and some do, to walk away from him. Now, the 12 stick with him. But there were a lot of other people who followed for a time, but in John chapter 6, a whole group of them turn away because they say, this teaching of Jesus is just too difficult. It's too much. We can't accept it. We can't accept Jesus. And Jesus says, fine. You don't have to stay. And they don't follow him. So Jesus doesn't try to manipulate and control people. And I say that to us because sometimes we get in patterns of behavior of trying to control others. And that's not loving. That's not loving like Jesus loved. And so, we look at people, and, I have people in my congregation in Livonia that I don't agree with on any number of issues. But it doesn't mean that they're not my brother or sister. It doesn't mean that I can't accept them and love them as Jesus did, and Jesus does. Because if we reject someone because of some stance they have politically or in some other area of life, maybe they like Ohio State rather than Michigan, I don't know, stuff like that, But the point being is that Jesus accepted people and loved them, even when they were wrong, even when they didn't see it the way Jesus was trying to teach them. Paul writes in 1 Corinthians 13, just a few words in verse 7. He says, love always protects, always trusts, always hopes, always perseveres. We often talk about, love is this or that. But Paul says this is how love acts. This is how love is when we are with people. And I have to confess, when I fail to love, it's often I fail in these areas that I don't protect. I don't persevere with people. I don't trust them. Love is something that Jesus exhibited to his disciples because he respected them. He wanted them to follow him, but he respected their right, their freedom as human beings to make choices. That's hard. The third thing that I would like to point out, that because Jesus loved them, is he forgave them. Now, when I say forgive, and forgiveness is part of the gospel, we believe in the forgiveness of sins, right? We come to Christ wanting to be forgiven, and we are. But I look at the disciples, and I recognize that forgiveness in that case was a lot more basic and important. Because these men abandoned Jesus on this night that he was betrayed. One of them denied him 3 times. And so when I talk about forgiveness, I think Jesus had to specifically turn to those disciples, and Peter in particular, and say to them, I forgive you. I forgive you because you failed, and I warned you, and especially to Peter, he warned them specifically, and yet Peter failed. I look at the accounts of the resurrection, and in 1 Corinthians 15, there's I think a really verse that's got a lot of hidden, unspoken subtext there. Listen to it. He says, he was raised on the 3rd day, according to the Scriptures, and that he appeared to Peter, and then to the 12. Well, now we have an account of Jesus appearing to the 12, right? But evidently he appeared first to Peter, and we have nothing in the Gospels about that particular meeting. But imagine in your mind, just for a moment, what that meeting was like. Peter, just a few days before, had denied Jesus 3 times. He must have, and it says, when he realized what he had done, he went out and wept bitterly. He was a broken person because of what he did. And then suddenly the resurrected Jesus appears to him. What do you think Jesus said to him? What do you think Peter said? Do you think Peter could even talk through his tears, his weeping? And so we find this, that forgiveness is a very real thing. And while we are forgiven, I think sometimes it does us good to think about Jesus specifically forgiving us of those failures that we feel so much guilt about. Those things that Jesus forgives because he loves us. He loves you, he loves me. He's not angry with us. He forgives us. He loves us. And this brings us to a point that I think's connected, is that Jesus also gives people second chances, third chances, fourth chances, fifth chances. You can take it on out as far as you want to go. Jesus gives people other chances. Now, when we read on in the Gospel of John, chapter 21, this is where Jesus meets with Peter on the shore, probably of Galilee, where they have been fishing. And then he speaks to Peter specifically. And he asks him 3 times the same question. Peter, do you love me? And Peter's response is, Lord, you know I love you. I love you. But he keeps asking. He asks him 3 times. I have to think that it's mirroring the 3 denials that Peter made. And each time he says this, Jesus says to him, feed my lambs. Take care of my sheep. Feed my sheep. In other words, Jesus is saying, Peter, I have chosen you to be a shepherd. I have chosen you to be a leader in the church. Now, Peter felt probably the least qualified to be that leader because he had failed so miserably. But Jesus says, no. I want you to be my shepherd. I want you to shepherd my sheep, to feed my sheep. And so I think in that passage what we're seeing is that Jesus is saying, Peter, you are still the person I chose to lead among the disciples. And so he says, Peter, you are the person. You failed. But now I give you another chance. And the thing about giving people second chances, because you maybe have given people chances before and they've burned you, they fail again and again. But Jesus always is there to give another chance. And when you give someone a second chance or a third chance, there's always the chance they will fail again. Just as there's a chance they will succeed. Jesus keeps giving people chances. He does that for us. He did it for Peter. He did it for all the disciples. Because he loved them. And then he turns around and says, what? Love each other as I have loved you. Figuring that out, seeing the implications of those words in our lives and how we treat each other and how we go through our life together as the people of God is really important. I will only be known as a disciple of Jesus by how I love other people, by how I love you, and in the same token, how we love each other as the people of God. So this morning, as I close this message, I hope that you will be thinking about how you can love better, how you can love more like Jesus. And if there's some that haven't obeyed Christ or haven't started on the journey with Jesus, then we offer that invitation. We sing, we say that if you want to do that today, that's possible. If you want to start again, if you want to get that second, third, fourth, fifth, however many chances it may be to follow Jesus, it's there for you today, right now. And so if you do need to do that, if you want to do it, then please recognize, come talk to us, and we will help you in your obedience to Jesus. Let's all sing this next song.